we start and end our sessions on time, you know. So this is, as they say in the airlines industry, this is pushback time. Good morning. Thank you for being here. Thank you for your interest in the topic, which is very dear to my heart, which is tomorrow's India. My name is Pradeep Anand. I'm the program chair for the entire conference, but if there was one particular breakout session I was most interested in, is this one. And I have the greatest pleasure, one of the greatest pleasures in life. This is a very emotional day for me. December 8th, 2010, my mother passed away. And she was one of those very idealistic, driven by the founding fathers of India, participated in the freedom movement. And to her, this topic would have been very, very close to her heart. And this is my way of saying thank you to her and for putting and instilling those and inspiring me the same principles. And I have here a group headed by, moderated by my great super friend, Arjun Devecha. I'm amazed that I needed to bring along his formal bio to read it out to you, but I've known Arjun since 1970-something, for a very, very long time. He's a graduate of the Indian Institute of Technology, Bombay. He's a contemporary of mine and a dear friend. But the reason he is here is because he's the head of GMO's Emerging Markets Equity Team and chairman of the GMO's Board of Directors. GMO, founded in 1977, is a privately held global investment management firm that, as of June 2013, manages about $108 billion in client assets. This is the emerging markets guru, the best one in the world that I know of. And a lot of analysts think so too. Prior to joining GMO in 1993, Arjun spent 12 years at Bharat directing software development, marketing, client service, and emerging markets research and development. He holds a bachelor's, as I mentioned, from IIT Bombay and an MBA in finance from Cornell University. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Arjun Devecha.
Thank you, Pradeep. It is really a great pleasure to be here with friends like Pradeep and have such an illustrious audience as yourselves. With such an illustrious audience as yourselves. As Pradeep suggested, what I do is I manage an emerging markets equity portfolio. And what that means is basically I manage money for large institutions like Harvard University, Princeton University, and people like that. And I invest their money in emerging markets, including India. So I'm going to start out kind of big, talking about emerging markets, and then focus down into India. And just before we get started, a couple of just points of how we're going to do this. I think each of us is going to speak fairly briefly, 5-10 minutes each. And what I've observed, certainly with all the other sessions that I've been to, the ones that worked the best were the ones where there was a lot of interaction from the audience. So we've tried to keep as much time for that. And so we expect that question and answer period to be the real meat of the session. So we have a number of volunteers who are around, and they have pieces of paper. So if you need to ask a question, just put up your hand. They'll bring a piece of paper for you. You can write it down. You can send it up here. And while we're answering those, we can also answer questions from the floor. So let's get started. As I said, I'm going to start with kind of the big picture about emerging markets. And what I want to say to you, basically, is that I think that over the next 20 years at least, emerging markets have a very, very bright future. And the reason has to do with a couple of things. So one of the things that we've learned about economic development is that as poor people and poor countries get richer, the first thing that they do is to save all they possibly can. And so what happens essentially is that in the early stages of wealth creation, you find that savings rates tend to rise. But what we find is that they don't rise continuously. So what I have here is 4 countries that became rich in the last 100 years. And essentially, what you'll see if you look at the far left of each of these charts is that when these countries were really poor, savings rates were low. As wealth increased, savings rate went up. But again, it doesn't keep going up. You'll see in every one of these cases, there's a point where it kind of peaks out and then comes back and plateaus at a lower level. And the reason why this happens is basically very simple, is that when you have no food to eat and you make some money, you're going to eat with what you can today, but you'll save all you can for tomorrow because who knows if you'll be able to eat. As you get richer, clearly, you have disposable resources that become available to you once you have food, once you have shelter, and things like that. But what we found is that the range where this peak occurs tends to be extremely consistent across countries. And that is, it's in a range of about $3,000 to $10,000 current dollars per capita GDP. And the reason essentially is because that's the range at which the governments effectively become rich enough, or the country becomes rich enough to start to provide a social safety net in terms of retirement, in terms of healthcare, things like that. So that's why you see that peak and things start to come down. Now, why is this important? This is important because right now, 50% of emerging markets in general are in this sweet spot. Now, India isn't yet there. It's about $1,700 to $2,000, but it's getting there very, very quickly. And so the idea is that in the near future, India will be in this range. China is very much in the middle. It's at about 5,000. Now, why does this matter? Because what happens is basically when you get into this range, you get a massive nonlinearity in the elasticity of demand. For those of you who don't speak economics, what that means is that for small changes in income, you get massive changes in consumption. So let me give you a simple example. Back in the year 2000, China for the first time crossed $1,000 per capita GDP. In that same year was the first time they sold 1 million vehicles. Now fast forward 10 years to 2010, income went from 1,000 to 4,000. What do you think happened to car sales? Did they go from 1 million to 4 million? No, they went to 17 million. That's the nonlinearity that I'm talking about. That's what happens when you get into the sweet spot. And this is true for all goods and services, again, at different price points. So the bottom line is basically that 10 years ago, 20 years ago, emerging markets were not in this place. Most of them were far below that 3,000 kind of threshold. Now you have 50% of them, and in years to come, increasingly there'll be more and more. There'll be Bangladesh and Nigeria and a number of other countries. So that's one thing that is going to happen over the next 10 to 20 years. But let me show you kind of why this is the case. It's really interesting. This is an academic study that we took from a couple of academics. And what it shows you, in fact, is this elasticity of demand. That is, what is the propensity of people to buy cars at different income levels? On the far left, what you see is basically that clearly when you have no money, you may have a desire to buy a car, but you can't afford it. So as affordability increases, car sales go up dramatically. And what this shows you is not total car sales, but the first derivative of car sales. And I can say that because I know you're all IITians. So basically, this is the elasticity of car sales. Now, the interesting thing to me is that it peaks out not at $30,000, but about $9,000. And when I first saw this, I thought, no, this is surely wrong. How could the maximum elasticity of demand be at 9,000? And the answer is actually quite simple. Because once you reach 9,000, then enough people have already bought cars. You see? So then it becomes a replacement car market as opposed to a new car market. So my point is that the maximum, in some sense, demand change that occurs is really, again, in this $3,000 to $10,000 range. So again, I'm trying to reinforce the point that as these countries come into these ranges, consumption of all goods and services goes up dramatically. And that's why we see in the next 10 to 20 years, there's going to be a huge rebalancing in global demand for all kinds of goods and services, away from the developed world, more and more towards the emerging world. Now let me kind of show you why this is going to be even bigger than what you might think. And it has to do with demographics. That is, the number of people who are coming into their middle class age years or their earning years is not static through time. What this graph shows you is something that's known as the dependency ratio. It's essentially the proportion of non-working age to working age people in a society. So the blue line shows you the emerging markets. And what you see here is that the way to interpret it is that back in the 1960s and 70s, for every 100 working age people, they needed to support something like 80 people who are either under 15 or over 65. As a result, they couldn't really save, therefore they couldn't really have discretionary spending. And you can see the story of the last 50 years, and in fact, the reason why people like me have jobs managing emerging markets money is because of what you see that blue, what happened to that blue line. That is, emerging markets have received a massive demographic dividend. That is, today, those same 100 people only have to support 50 people. And that has had a massive impact on these societies. And you can see, for emerging as a whole, and I'm going to get to India in a second, what you can see essentially is that for the next 20 years, they're not only in the sweet spot, but they remain in the sweet spot. There's the best labor to non-labor kind of condition that exists. Conversely, in the developed world, and I'm sure most of you are familiar with this, as the baby boomers retire, you can see that the demographics get considerably worse. So the point being that essentially you have this massive rebalancing effect that is going to occur. Now, what is the implication of this rebalancing effect? What this means in plain English is that more and more of the hours available to be worked are shifting from the developed world to the emerging world. Therefore, more and more of the dollars earned are going to be there, and therefore, more and more of the dollars spent are going to be there. That's what basically the thesis. So now let's look within emerging markets, and specifically at India, to see what does India's demographic profile look like, because this is going to be very, very important. So I have here 4 countries: Japan, US, China, and India. Let's start with Japan. That's the red line. What you will see is that Japan's demographic actually peaked in 1990. That is when they had the best demographic. And since then, it is not only deteriorating at a terrible rate, but is going to continue to do so for quite a long time. I think, again, for those of you who study this kind of stuff, you know that Japan and Italy are the 2 countries which have the worst demographic problem. And Japan has a particularly big problem because they don't have immigration. And it's very hard for them to basically have immigration. So they have no solution to this problem. They really have an aging population which they can't do very much about, which is why companies like Sony are very interested in robotics and doing robots, because they figure that that is going to be one of the solutions to the aging problem. If you look at the US, relative to almost all other developed countries, looks better than pretty much any other country. You look at Italy, you look at France, you look at all of those, they all look more like Japan. The US is the best off amongst all the developed countries for one very, very simple reason, and that has to do with immigration. And not only does the US have a better profile than most developed countries, it is probably the only country, along with Australia and Canada, that can accept immigrants at every level of society. I mean, look at this room, right? I mean, we got a bunch of very accomplished professionals. I mean, think of it. Could you have a group of IITians like this in Germany? No way. Could not happen. This could only happen in a place like the US. Okay? So the US is actually, amongst developed countries, pretty well off. Let's look at India and China. China, interestingly enough, their demographic is just about peaking right now in the next year or 2. Now, if you look at the China and India curves, you'll see that until about 1970, the 2 were kind of closely following each other, and then they very sharply diverged. The divergence occurred because of the one-child policy. So this is basically, you can see the impact of the one-child policy over there, which means that right now, you know, they have enjoyed this massive demographic dividend, but it is about to end. Okay? The interesting thing is that why China, and this is, excuse me, the reason why China has been able to develop so rapidly over the last 30 years. And it turns out that this is necessary for China to have had the extreme growth, but it is not sufficient. It turns out that there are 2 other things that needed to happen for China to basically be in the space that they have been in. So first, you got this great demographic dividend, but as I like to say, demographic dividends are not unequivocally positive. That is, if you don't educate people, if you don't have jobs for those people, they turn negative. So I give you the example of a number of the Arab countries, where essentially you've had no education, no jobs equals revolution. So in China, similarly, you know, they had 2 great things which went for them really well. One was the Deng Xiaoping's reforms of the late 70s, 78, 77, is when he basically shifted China from a socialist or communist country to a capitalist country. So that created industries, that created jobs, and created education for a whole bunch of people. But even that would not have been sufficient because, okay, you can have all these factories building all this stuff, but who are you going to sell it to? Because remember, China was isolated from the rest of the world. And so the final piece was actually Nixon opening up the American market to China. That was the other key piece. And so you needed all these three for China to have this rapid development. Let's switch to India. What you see is that India, in fact, pretty much of any country in the world, at this point in time, has the best demographic profile. That is, right now, we have been receiving a demographic dividend, and we will continue to receive that till 2040. The question in my mind is that, do you squander it? Do you actually use are we the Arab countries or are we China? And that's why I think the key to this is going to be education. Now, my opinion is that the Indian government has not been doing enough on the education front. We have a real problem from an education point of view. We have a lot of young people coming into our society, but we do not have sufficiently good, at every level, primary, secondary, tertiary, every level, we do not have enough education. And so my point is that India has great potential, but there's nothing inevitable about that potential. You have to make it happen. Let me just give you a final slide about all this demographics and all this kind of stuff, that this is not just something that I'm talking about what's going to happen 10 or 20 years from now. Let me show you the reality of what has happened already. This shows you total car sales in the world. The red line is the developed markets, the blue line is emerging markets. What you can see is that sometime in 2009, these two lines crossed. And what that says is that today, there are more cars sold in the emerging world than there are in the developed world. Now, this is by number of units, not by dollars, because the cars sold in the emerging world are still cheaper. So from a dollar point of view, that wouldn't be the case yet. But I want to make 2 points. One is that these two lines, having crossed, are unlikely to cross any time again in my lifetime. That's point one. And point two is look at the red line. That's the developed line, even prior to the crisis of 2008, was flat to slightly down. So this is not a time when economics were particularly bad. Remember, the 2000s were a fairly decent decade from an economic growth point of view. The reason why it is slightly downward has to do with the demographics. 65-year-olds do not replace a car with one car. They replace a car with 0.9 cars. 85-year-olds replace a car with exactly 0.0 cars. Right? Anyway, the point is that I believe that the future for these countries is very, very rosy because of the demographics and because of where they are in the income spectrum. But there's nothing inevitable. India has to get to that $3,000, $4,000 level before it can enjoy a lot of these benefits of kind of this stuff happening. Okay, so with that, I'll turn it over. And each of the speakers is going to introduce themselves, so save me the task of doing that.
So my name is Yatendra Agarwal, and I'm a graduate of IIT Bombay, 1984, mechanical engineering. For many years, I worked with Schlumberger International in oil field services. And for last 4 or 5 years, I'm doing something quite different through a trust set up by me. I think that I'm bringing hope in our country, in some of the remotest parts of the country. So I will go through the presentation really fast because the time is short. There's nothing technical. Mostly it is pictures. I hope you enjoy it. Yeah. So through Eco Solutions, I'm giving solar lamps to those villages which will not see light for next couple of decades. So these are very, very remote. So they could be in the islands of Brahmaputra River. They could be on the border of Nagaland and Burma. They could be in Mizoram. They could be in the Himachal, in the Lahore Spiti Valley. So we go very remote, very, very remote. Yeah? And we are really reaching out to the poorest in the country. Lot of people here have talked about education, healthcare. There are many NGOs which are working in that domain. I decided to do work which would make an impact on the first day itself. And the reason for that is it's a very small NGO, and I wanted to have an immediate impact. Yeah, so bring hope on the first day. So, for example, when I give this lamp, all the person has to do is to just press the button, and he has light in his house. And many of them might have been struggling from independence, to try to get light in their homes. Yeah. Slowly and steadily, we have covered many, many parts of the country, as you can see in this map. It's really spread all over. Every single dot is a really, really remote village. Yeah? So this is an example of how this whole thing got triggered. Panvel, as you know, is just a half an hour drive from Bombay. There was an article in the newspaper saying how 4 villages having a total, homes of about 800 homes, they have been struggling to get light. And, they just didn't get, for last 30 years, the villagers have been fighting for it. Yeah. So using these solar lamps, it just took us 2 days, and it was done. Everybody had light. And, that showed me that it is very easy to do this. It's really easy. So all we have to do is to just go and reach out. Yeah? All over India, where there is no light, the women have to face the brunt, and often, they have to live in darkness. Typically, a bottle filled with kerosene is all what they have in the night time. In many places like Kashmir, they can't even afford kerosene, so they just burn pine wood. Yeah? So when you give a solar lamp, you're giving a better quality light to them. This is a photograph in Rajasthan on the border with Pakistan, where this villager had never seen light in his life. And when I went there and when I showed the lamp, to him it was unbelievable. He was staring at the lamp for almost 1 hour because he said, I've never seen anything like this in my life. Remember, in the remote parts of the country, the people don't travel like we travel. Often their lives are just within 5 to 10 kilometers of where they were born. So if they were in a bad part, where there is no resource, that is how it is going to be. I just want to briefly mention that the lamps which we give are the best in the world, because there is no point, in giving substandard quality products. Solar lamps we have been listening about since our childhood, so there is nothing new about solar lamps. The government has also been giving plenty of solar lamps, but mostly the lamps fail, and the lamps fail because the battery dies. And in this chart, I'm showing how the battery life has changed with technology. So the lead acid batteries typically last for a year, whereas the new generation of lithium ferrophosphate batteries last for over 5 years. So ideally, when you are making the effort of reaching out to a remote place, you really want to give a lamp which lasts for a long, long time. Yeah? So that is what we do. We give really the good quality lamps. How do we reach out? Well, at least I use the Google quite a bit. So this is an example of northeast of India. And then, you can zoom in and you decide, a valley, and then you start zooming in. And this is an example of how you can see the village and you can count the number of huts there. So like that, you can map the whole valley. You can actually figure out before even going there that how many homes are there, which you will need to light up. Yeah? Reaching out is very, very difficult in these remote places. This is an example how we are crossing the river. And often you have to go in boats. It's quite risky also. This is in Arunachal Pradesh. This is a village in the Brahmaputra River, very remote towards Arunachal Pradesh, and where we lit up the home with these lights. Again, as I mentioned, reaching out is difficult. This is near Matheran, near Bombay, where we are climbing up the hill, and it takes 4 to 5 hours to reach, high up places. I'm going to talk something different now. This is a common sight if you are in the rural part of India. Women or men carrying wood on their head. And this wood is needed to cook food in the night in their homes. To me, always this was a very, very disgusting sight. It was very disgusting. So recently, this is a photograph of Rajasthan where the women is cooking food. You can see the twigs. In Rajasthan, there are no forests. So there are just these wild shrubs. And the women break the shrubs, and that is what they use for cooking. This is an example in Madhya Pradesh where you can see a person using wood to cook food. The walls are absolutely black. The whole room is filled with smoke. And that is all he knows. But now, by using good technology, you have well-designed stoves available in our country. And all you have to do is to reach out with these stoves. So you can see how nicely the flame is burning. The smoke level practically drops to 0. And the heat energy is also quite large. This is an example in Chhattisgarh where you can see a photograph of a traditional chula and a new stove, which I had given to them. Why does the stove work better? Because it is well designed. It has got an airflow mechanism. In the annular space, there are holes, and there are holes at the bottom of the stove. So when you put the wood and the wood starts burning, it heats up the stove, and the cold air from outside comes from the bottom in the annular space, rises up, and from the holes at the top, it comes down on the wood again. So the wood gets more oxygen, it burns better, and by using this stove, there is a 50% reduction in wood consumption. So the same women, when I talk, after I give them the stove, they say that the wood which they were carrying on their head, which typically used to go away in 2 to 3 days of cooking in their house, is now being used for 7 to 8 days. So it's really wood conservation also. The level of smoke, because it drops dramatically, it has a direct bearing on the health of the women. As we reach out to far off places, it has always been in my mind that while you give lamps and you can give chulas, really you need to create employment, because that is where the answer is. So this is in Uttarakhand. Recently we have given a small food processing unit, and they have used it to make jams and jellies. This is another example of how we tripled the production of agriculture in Maharashtra. This is using solar dryers to dry vegetables. I'm just going quickly through this. So I just have 2 more slides. By providing solutions which are reliable, low cost, and incorporating the latest technologies, by setting examples of good work, and by letting the local government know about the work, we can reach out. The government of India has been very, very supportive. In the remotest parts of the country, they have gone all out to support me in my work. So I'm really thankful to the government. As I travel across the country, I have realized that there is tremendous knowledge in our country. All we need to do is to reach out, and somehow that knowledge has to be dissipated in the remote villages. And lastly, we always, have to do our work with love. Stop worrying about how large you will grow. Just do your work properly and with great love. Thank you.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Harish Parvathaneni. I'm the Consul General of India based in Houston. I think I'll just take a digression from what the previous 2 speakers have addressed. The lives of nations are more than the economy. Economy is important. We all need to earn a livelihood. But as we enter the 6th decade of life as an independent republic, I think we need to go back and ponder what was it that animated the founding fathers when they sat down in the Constituent Assembly to chart out a constitution for the new republic. I think when Dr. Ambedkar, an unusual lawyer in India for that era, because most of the other lawyers were all educated in Britain, he was the sole exception in the freedom movement of a lawyer who was educated at Columbia and who came and studied the US Constitution, went back and took the ideas from the US Constitution, the Bill of Rights. And when he went back, he decided that here in India, we shall be a republic where there shall be equality. But he said, we will chart political equality for our citizens, where it shall be one man, one vote, one value. Yet, he said, while we shall have political equality, in our economic and social life, it will be a long time before we are able to achieve one man, one value. The real challenge, he said, for the fledgling republic was to ensure that the dissonance created between political equality and social and economic equality should not blow up the foundations of the republic. That dissonance continues to this day. But he was also optimistic. When he crafted the Constitution, he was very clear what the future of India should be. He identified that India as a republic will have a national civic identity of a citizen, not a national ethnic identity of a citizen. Every individual citizen would be important, and every individual citizen would have rights and responsibilities under the Constitution. Yet, he was also very clear that we were a very unequal society then as we are now. So he said, we have groups who have been disadvantaged for centuries. So the concept of equality should not mask group differentiated inequalities that exist. And there must be special provisions which will enable them to realize their full potential. So our Constitution, while it recognizes individual rights, it also recognizes group differentiated rights of various categories based on gender, special provisions for women, based on age, special provisions for children and the aged, based on race, socially and economically backward classes, based on communities, special provisions, for example, for the Anglo-Indian community at the time of independence, which continues to this day. So we have linguistic and social minorities. For a 1.2 billion people, we have over 4,600 communities, 80% of which are not just social and cultural communities, but actually distinct social categories. We also have significant numbers of religious minorities, almost 1/5 of our population. We also have a number of linguistic minorities with special provisions who are allowed to run their own educational institutions and train their children in their institutions. So these are provisions which are there in the Constitution. Since the time of our independence, of course, as a nation, we have been through ups and downs. But why do I say that the future is bright? Because while cars are important, the economy is important, and of course, while we need to ensure that the demographic dividend is fully realized by training our people to take advantage of the opportunities that open up. What I spent yesterday night until 3 a.m. watching the elections of the 4 states in India is the best proof. Why do I say this? Because we have had so many revolutions everywhere else on the planet, ranging from Ukraine to the Middle East. And of course, we have had a lot of people who came onto the street in the last 2-3 years protesting and voicing their opinion. Yet, a new party was formed. It was registered with the Election Commission of India. They outlined a program of activities. They participated in the elections, and the results were out yesterday. Some of them went to the Supreme Court and said, we want an option, none of the above, the so-called nota option. We want to show our dissent with the candidates that may be put up. The Supreme Court agreed with their version and directed the government and the Election Commission that ballots henceforth shall have a none of the above option. Such an option was instituted. Friends, guess what? Yesterday, when the results were out, for example, in the National Capital Territory of Delhi, what percentage of the voters do you think had opted for none of the above option?
1%.
0.7%.
Yeah.
What does this mean? This means that people believe in the constitutional processes that we have. People believe that democracy works. People believe that elections are held, that governments can be changed through the process of the ballot box, contrary to what you see in other parts of the world. They go through the process. Yet, nothing is preordained. Our history could have been different. Our future could have been different. There was no guarantee in 1947 or in 1950 about what the future of India would be, whether the constitution would be as it is, what will be the various fissures in the body politic, having just gone through a significant partition and violence. None of that, all the prognosis didn't turn out the way people thought it would. Why? Because as a people, while we have and continue to be economically and socially unequal, yet politically equal and empowered, we realize that it's still a work in progress. But let us ask ourselves, is this something that's unique to India? If so, why would President Obama last week highlight that his #1 policy agenda is to work for removing social inequality? Is this again something that is unique to India? If so, why would the Pope say that addressing social inequality through the papacy is one of his most important goals? The fact remains that economic and social inequality is a fact of life, not just in the emerging world or in the emerging market economies, but in world in general, among humanity in general. This is something we should address. Yes, it is our responsibility as a nation to ensure that everyone's potential has the opportunity to be fully realized. We have in place a political structure to do so, and that political structure has remained strengthened, amended many times, and continues to be amended as new demands are made on the polity. So, for example, the constitutions are amended to accommodate the aspirations of various parts, of various communities in India. Yet, it's still a work in progress. In addition to this, I just would like to make one more point before we address other issues in the question and answer session. I think when we look at the future of any nation, the futures or the past histories of nation, of course, economy is an important part. As I said, we all have to earn a livelihood. But it's much more about who we are as a people and as a civilization. I think we today are in a sweet spot where we have had a decade or two of growth, and we should continue on our developmental priority as we try to take millions of our people out of poverty. There is a great aspirational gap. There are young people who would like everything that they wish to achieve be achieved as quickly as possible. This is something the system must address. Yet, who we are as a people is as much about who we are as a society and a polity as it is about who we are as an economy. This is true for the past of India. This shall continue to be true about the future of India. Thank you.
Good morning, everybody. My name is John Fennerty, and unfortunately, I'm not an IIT graduate, which means I'm really thoroughly intimidated. I think I'm the only one in this room who's probably not an IIT graduate. So bear with me while I try to keep up with everybody else. Listening to the other three speakers, it makes me wish I had been here for the whole conference over the 3 days, because I think I learned more in the last 20 minutes than I've learned over the last year on the India desk. I'm the office of the director of the Office of India Affairs at the State Department. Our job is sort of to manage on a day-to-day basis the U.S.-India bilateral relationship, working in conjunction with our embassy and our 4 consulates in India. There's asset managers from San Francisco are making me look really good, because we did exactly that analysis about 20 years during the Clinton administration, where basically the U.S. made a strategic bet that India was going to become one of our most important bilateral relationships. And this was in 1991 when Manmohan Singh was finance minister and had launched the modern era of economic reforms in India. That bet continued through the Clinton administrations, the Bush administration, and it's continued into the Obama administration, interrupted. And you all, your very presence in this room makes us look pretty good. We made a pretty good bet. And the reason we did it was basically on the same analysis, the demographics, trends. Adding to the demographic issues, if you look at, looking at India, I'm supposed to talk about the opportunities and the challenges. Okay, if you put India in there and put a balance sheet out there in terms of its assets, in terms of demographics, India is not going to peak demographically until 2070. In 2020, the average age in India will be 29 years, I believe. In the United States and China at the same time, it will be 37. And of course, the trends in China will be continuing aging. In Japan, it'll be 49, and in Europe, 45. So the huge, half of the population of India today is under 25, 65% of India is under 35, which means by 2020, India will have, without a doubt, the largest consumer technical skilled labor market in the world if, as folks have said, India gets it right in terms of educating that emerging 10 million graduates from secondary schools each year. That's really the challenge in India. So the asset sheet shows huge demographic advantages, strong GDP growth because of the economic reforms that have slowed down over the last 3 years because there's been a relaxation of the economic reforms. The fact that the literacy rate has doubled in the last 10 years, now it's 70%. The life expectancy has doubled, now 70 years old. Tremendous strides have been made in India since the modern economic reforms. Now on the liability side of the sheet, the challenges for India is the educational process, is getting that huge influx of Indians, 10 million of which annually are moving from the rural area into the urban area. A huge challenge to educate those folks. The other liability on the balance sheet is much as what's more extreme you see even happen in the United States today, and that is the economic inequality. I mean, if you look at India regionally, northern India is a heck of a lot poorer than southern India. The per capita income average in India, somewhere around $1,700. But if you look at Uttar Pradesh, it's $500. If you look at Bihar, it's $300. Huge disparities, and these are the two states together which comprise, a third of the population of India, a larger population than the United States. UP has a larger population than Brazil. So huge socioeconomic challenges in India. The other one that I would point out, that one that we've been working extensively with India on, is the infrastructure, both the human and physical infrastructure development. We've been working with the government, which has announced that it will need, over the next 10 years, $1 trillion in infrastructure investment to bring India up into the modern era. But half of that, they've admitted to us frankly, will have to come from the private sector. But in order to get that $500 billion out of the private sector, the government is going to have to incentivize private investment, both Indian domestic private investment and foreign direct investment. And quite frankly, in terms of the government's track record on attracting foreign investment, it did well when I was in Delhi from 2005 to 2009. But over the last 4 years, it hasn't had a good track record. And again, it's because the momentum of the economic reform process that was sustained through the first 15 years has flagged a bit in the last 3 or 4 years. So again, another challenge. But again, we remain highly bullish on India. And as a result, what we've done is we have really ramped up our engagement with India across the board. We now have 30 dialogues with India across anything you can imagine, spectrum, from health, science and technology, defense, counterterrorism, climate change, you name it, we work extensively with India. And the reason is, and this is going more to the 30,000-foot level, but we also made a strategic bet, again on the basis of demographics, that the future is in Asia, Asia specifically, to be exact, because right behind Asia as a growing region of the world is Latin America, where I came from. I just came from Argentina. I spent 3 years in Argentina, a year and a half ago coming to the Indian desk. So we have looked at the world, and we, the US government, have pretty much figured out that by far the lion's share of the growth is going to be in the Asia-Pacific region for the 21st century. And India is the southern anchor of that rebalance to Asia. India is a linchpin in this rebalance to Asia. It is a strategic part of our calculus in terms of where the future of the U.S. growth and relationships are. And the beauty about the U.S.-India relationship is that if you look at the converging interests of our two countries across the spectrum, with very, very few exceptions, we have the same interests, the exact same interests. And we also have the exact same challenges. And when I'm going to stop here on one figure I find fascinating. This is in the energy sector. This, one of the success stories in India has actually been the development of solar energy. It surprised all of us 5 years ago. None of us thought solar power was going to be economically viable as a major deployable energy asset, and yet look what's happened to solar prices over the last 5 years. It shows you the unpredictability out there in terms of energy policy and where our energy needs and resources are coming from. But somebody told me at a climate change conference that the reason India is so important is that you have about 5 million residential air conditioners in India today. By the year 2020, there will be probably 300 million residential air conditioning units. That increase in air conditioning will account for all of the global renewable energy development in the next 15 years. That's how important India is to the global economy and to everything we're trying to do globally and economically. Without India as a partner, we simply won't be able to tackle these global challenges. And so, concluding, I'm heartened by what happened in Bali yesterday, because frankly, in the end, it was the US and India coming to an agreement on agriculture after very, very difficult negotiations, after everybody had given the WTO summit in Bali up for dead. Our ability to work together to come to an agreement, if we could do that over something as contentious as agricultural subsidies, which, believe me, having been involved in them, there's nothing nastier than talking about agriculture in both countries. If we can do that, we can do just about anything. Thank you.
So we're going to switch over to kind of a question and answer period. I already have a large number of questions here, but as we go forward, we'll also take a few questions from the audience. I'm actually going to start out, and the way we do it is that I'll read out questions and, you're open to, if anybody should, and whoever feels like they'd like to answer it, they can. And actually, I'll start out with a political question for John. That is, with the impending withdrawal of US troops from Afghanistan, clearly that is likely to have some fairly large impact on India in terms of especially India-Pakistan relations and things like that. How do you see that playing out, and how do you, what's your view on that?
That's a great question. It's actually one we talk to the Indian government about a lot, obviously. First of all, let me say this. First of all, the Indian government's role in the future of Afghanistan is extremely important. India is one of the largest contributors to economic development in Afghanistan among the coalition partners, $2 billion today. India has obviously, huge strategic interests in ensuring that Afghanistan remains stable and ensuring that the threat of terrorism does not emanate out of Afghanistan into the Indian homeland. What we've told the Indians and what we've told all of our coalition partners and all the parties that are interested in a stable Afghanistan is that the U.S. is not leaving Afghanistan. We have hit a stage in the Afghan development where we can increasingly turn over the security protection to the Afghan citizens to the Afghan military forces. So while we are drawing down our troop levels in Afghanistan, and we haven't announced or come up with the final level of of the coalition forces that remain, we are not leaving Afghanistan. We will remain engaged in Afghanistan, both militarily, economically, politically, across the spectrum, and we will work very closely with the Indian government, with the Pakistan government, and with all of our coalition partners to ensure that, you know, Afghanistan stays on track. I'm not going to minimize the challenges out there. We all know how incredibly challenging the Afghan environment is, but I think what's critical is that we work with our key partners, India being one of them, to ensure that all of the effort, all of the expenditures that all of us have put into Afghanistan over the last 10 years it was not in vain, that we ensure that we get it right. And we understand from the Indian government that there's nothing more important for them than the future stability of Afghanistan. In fact, one of the things we instituted over the last year since I was on the desk, or a year and a half since I was on the desk, is we now have a trilateral dialogue between Afghanistan, the United States, and India to discuss especially how we can ensure the economic and social development and working together on programs in Afghanistan in social economic development and education in other areas.
Did you care to comment, sir?
I think for us, Afghanistan is a very important neighbor. India's view is, of course, that both regional and other parts, their intervention in Afghanistan must be benign, intended to assist the people so that Afghanistan can spring back to the path of normalcy. I think India's developmental assistance was focused on social infrastructure, including hospitals, physical infrastructure, including roads and electricity transmission towers, a lot of human resource development. A lot of our experts are actually stationed in Afghanistan. We have been constantly under attack. My own batchmate was killed in the attack that took place against our embassy in Kabul. I think our commitment to the safety and stability of Afghanistan is unshaken. Of course, the drawdown process is something that we are closely watching and are having a close dialogue with both the Afghan and US partners. I think the one issue that we firmly believe in is that those who have been responsible for promoting terrorism must be held to account. That is something that has not happened in the region, both in the context of the situation in Afghanistan and in the context of the attacks at Mumbai. I think this is something that you have to look at in an integral manner, and this is something that we continue to insist, and this is the key to ensuring peace and stability in South Asia.
Thank you. So, Yatin, the question which says, for your product, the lamps, what happens to when the life lamp is exhausted? Do people have the capacity to buy and replace it? I mean, what's your program for doing that?
Okay, so as I mentioned in the slide, firstly, the batteries have a very long life, typically 4 to 5 years. The cost of replacement of the battery for the smallest lamp is about 100 rupees. And for the big lamp, it is 300 rupees. So these are low-priced batteries compared to the traditional lead-acid battery, which lasts only 1 year and costs anywhere from 250 rupees to almost 700 rupees, depending on the type of the battery. Now in India, we have the mobile phone, spread almost to all the places. And believe me, if anything goes wrong in the remotest part of the country, I immediately get a call saying that the lamp is not working. And so thanks to the mobile phone, people are in touch and we are able to deliver very fast to them. Yeah. So I'm not worried on that front at all. Yeah.
It's somewhat of an irony that people don't have electricity, but they have mobile phones.
So just to add on that, in the upper model, there is a mobile phone charging capability. So we might actually laugh that, we use mobile phone daily, But for people who live in remote places, this is a critical tool, because with the mobile phone, that is the only way they can communicate, either with hospitals or with the police or with anybody. So in very remote places, if you can believe, once they charge the phone, they actually use it very sparingly. And they actually try to drag the phone usage for about 7 days to 10 days there. So when they get such a product which can charge their mobile phone, it really helps them in their lives there.
There's a question on investing in India, and it's for pretty much everybody. What is your anticipation regarding the relaxation of foreign retail investment in India, and what impact, social and economic, might this have? So do you have any thoughts on that, sir?
I think the government's policy is in the public domain. It's now up to investors. I think there is always the need in any society to build political and social consensus before any policy is introduced, and that is probably the reason why the government took its time in building the political and social consensus needed to enable foreign direct investment in the retail sector. The government believes that allowing such investment in the retail sector is in the larger economic interests in terms of the scale and the technological improvements that it would bring to the whole supply chain. Of course, there are people who have a different point of view, even in India, and this is always a subject of a political debate. This is a subject which will come up in the elections and has in the past. So like in any society, like in any open democratic society, these are political and economic issues where everybody has a point of view, and these are determined in the public arena. So I think the government's view is that this is positive, and this is something that the country and the economy needs.
You have a thought on that?
Sure. I guess one thing I'll say for this is that we're hoping after the elections, when the government takes shape in late May, early June, that we can have another conversation where perhaps we can tweak the policy a bit so that it makes it a little more attractive to foreign investors. And I'm hopeful that'll happen. The one thing I would say, thing we've learned out of this process is now that the government has essentially left it up to each individual state to decide its policy on accepting multi-brand retail, and we have increasingly more states are interested, that we need to get smarter about engaging our companies, engaging at the state level. And that's something we are increasingly focused on, is getting down at the state level and engaging with the states to explain the benefits not only to the consumer and the job creation from multi-brand retail, but we believe that it could have a transformative effect on the rural sector as well. Half of all fruits and vegetables spoil in India before even reaching the market because of inadequate infrastructure and storage and the back end of the operations. And the companies that specialize, U.S. companies and other foreign companies that specialize in multi-brand retail, have extraordinary supply chain abilities that they can bring to the Indian market, where they can actually bring huge benefits to the rural sector in this area. So it's not just something that we think our companies would gain hugely by, but also the Indians, as well as particularly the Indians at the poorer end of the economic spectrum.
So let's take a question. Yes, sir?
My name is M.K. Singapta. I'm a geophysicist, and I had the opportunity to work as a principal geophysicist for Malaysia National Oil Company Petronas from 2005 to 2010. I never had been to Southeast Asia before, and this is the first time I went there, and I was really impressed with the development and everything that went in Malaysia. Malaysia, all we know, that got independent 10 years after India, 1957. But from the very first moment, the Malaysian government took the decision on the private investment. And all the development and growth, including all there, and that because of the foreign markets, foreign general distributors. So, you know that difference in the policy between Indian government from the very first day to use the indigenous product, which has some ideology, I agree, but on the practical matter, the investment by foreign countries gave Malaysia much bigger opportunities, much development, tourist attraction. A lot of tourists go there just for the development and having the hotel and everything. So that is, I think, we should consider also, India should consider also, I'm even sitting at home,
Excuse me, but I have to come in here. If you have a question, please write it down. There are volunteers out there who will take your question and pass it on here. And when you write down a question, it becomes very specific. And are there any other questions?
Yeah,
You've got a few.
I've got a bunch of questions here. So one of the questions here is, let me just repeat the point the gentleman made, was, for those of you who could not hear it, was that he spent some time in Malaysia, and what he saw essentially was that the development of Malaysia was considerably better than what he had seen in India, even though they got started 5 or 10 years later than India. And he attributes it largely to the fact that there was a lot of foreign investment. And so, you know, I think the question I'm interpreting is that, you know, what is your view of kind of domestic versus foreign investment for the development of a country like India?
Foreign investment by itself is not bad, but foreign investment in retail sector, where we really are not contributing.
Well, let's let the panelists answer.
No, I think we can argue till the cows come home, as they say, about what should have happened in the past. So I think the decisions that leaders make have an impact on the course of a nation. The decisions that our leaders in the past have made, they have made the decision keeping in view the facts and the circumstances that they had to face. In retrospect, we all have perfect vision, and it's a perfect world. So I think we just need to keep this in mind. But otherwise, I think in the life of our own country, let us acknowledge the fact that there has been a period of reform that began from 1991 onwards. Why that did not take place before, this is a matter for history. Again, you know, people can have their points of view. Is it related to circumstances? Is it related to personalities? As you said, is it an ideology? I'd just like to reiterate that to this day, the preamble of our Constitution describes India as a secular, democratic, socialist republic. So today, socialism can mean trying to achieve social equality, or trying to have an inclusive development and growth model so that all sections of the society are part of the growth process. So I don't look at everything in ideological terms. I think our leaders made the decisions for the circumstances that they faced. We have had an economic reform process for over 2 decades. So I think the focus of every generation of leaders is to build on what they have been handed over, rather than go back and look and say, why so-and-so took such a decision at a particular point of time in history. People can change the future, they can't change the past.
Yeah. Any other thoughts? Somewhat a difficult question to answer, but it says that we talk about the favorable demographic dividends. In an ideal situation, that would be true, but certain privileged classes have a vested interest in people being ignorant. When things are manipulated to the advantage of such ruling classes, how can one be rational in one's conclusion that the demographics will actually win out? And I'd say my answer to that is that there's no substitute for good government. Okay, at the end of the day, you know, you are dependent on how well the laws of the country are enforced. You can have the best legal and constitutional system, but if there's no enforcement of those laws, obviously it's not going to work. Just as an aside, one of the things that, you know, I've been managing money in emerging markets for 20 years now, And I spent a lot of time thinking, why is it that certain countries are rich and certain countries are poor? Now, obviously, there are 100 different factors, including colonial things and stuff like that. But when I look at each country, one thing kind of stands out. The difference between rich and poor countries is this. That is, rich countries, in my opinion, become rich because they build institutions that can survive bad government. The poor countries don't. So one of my favorite examples is Brazil. Brazil had 16 years of extremely good government under Mr. Cardoso and then under Mr. Lula. Now I think they have a terrible government, and they seem to be sliding back into kind of the morass that they had back in the 70s and 80s. Conversely, if you look at the Philippines, which is always known as the sick man of Asia, you know, for 50 years they had terrible governments and they had terrible economics. For the last few years, they've had a terrific government. Mr. Aquino has done a fantastic job, although I will say he's kind of fallen down a little bit in the response to the hurricane stuff. But 5 years from now, he'll be gone, and who the heck knows? The point being is that there's no substitute from a long-term point of view for good governance.
I just want to add with respect to a remote village in India. Through the government changes now, many of the government schemes which are being implemented in the villages, they set up what is known as a village committee, and the money comes into the account of the village committee, and the committee appoints 2 people who have to sign on the check. So what I have seen is the power now is coming to the village heads, and if you can reach out to them, and for example, in my case, with the chula or with the solar lamp, and if you can convince them that this is really good, especially in the remote areas, they are very, very willing to listen to you, and they act on it. So that's why towards the end of the speech, when I mentioned I'm thankful to the government of India, many of our products which have reached out in remote places is because of this change, the way the government money is now being spent. It is being spent with the signature of the villager.
I think the one other issue is also, I think the view that the questioner has taken is that a citizen has no individual agency. I think this is far from true. Even in a developing country context like India, yes, there is social and economic inequality. However, the mere fact that there is political inequality is a great empowering agent. People question. People want development to come, and people are asking questions about how quickly that can happen. I think when we look at education too, yes, I think the process of skilling our population can be done much better with better outcomes. However, what is lost sight of is in the last 10 years, the Sarva Siksha Abhiyan has ensured that every child who ought to be in school is actually in school. The debate no longer is whether the child is in school. The debate is, what are the educational outcomes of the child who is in school? The only question now is whether somebody who is in grade 5 actually has the language and mathematical skills of grade 5. So that is the issue. The issue is no longer whether the child is in school, because the child is in school. The issue is one of educational outcomes. The issue now is of teacher performance. How do you ensure that the teachers do their job that they ought to be doing? So I think in terms of our primary education, and increasingly in terms of our secondary education, we have gone through the first few steps. The issue of educational outcomes is something that is continuing to be an issue that will occupy the government's attention. So the skilling process after secondary education is again an issue. Technical and vocational training. Should everybody enter the university system? I think these are issues that need to be tackled. We are, of course, in touch even with our US partners, looking at the examples of community colleges in the US, and to see how best we can learn from various models of vocational training around the world, in Europe and in other places. So I think this is a work in progress.
Okay, I'm going to have one final question, which is a bit of a softball for you, Yatin. How can we help you?
I think a little bit of donation would help, but however, I would put a line on that is the way we work is we don't advertise at all. We are very, very low profile. In fact, nobody comes to know that we exist. So many people are uncomfortable with that when they are donating. They want their name and everything. So we don't do that at all. And the reason I ask for donation is because I consider, myself only as a seeder. So, we just keep seeding different parts of the country, and that is what the donation helps. The real major, initiative will actually come from the government. So wherever we go, that small donation which comes, let's say we light up a village, and then obviously the surrounding 10 or 20 villages, they get the message, and the government then acts on it.
Great, thank you.
So what do you think? How was the session? Thank you. When I was asked to speak at the beginning of the conference, in the welcome session, I said, we are graduates of the Indian Institutes of Technology. Okay, so there will be Indians, India, and Indianness to our conference. And this is one component which is very close to my heart. Thank you all for coming. We appreciate it very much, especially, if you look at the 4 different aspects, Arjun Divecha, our Consul General, the State Department, John Fannerty, and Yatin, all the way from Bombay, Navi Mumbai, right? They've come from different distances, San Francisco, Houston, DC, Bombay, and all of them have come here on a very, very voluntary basis to be here because of the conference. So as a token of our appreciation, we have a little gift in a big box. First, Yatin.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you so much, sir.